Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 29 in the 50-part series going through the JonBenet Ramsey timeline and through kind of the canon. In this episode we're going to be dealing with the Bonita Papers. It's a fascinating narrative from Bonita Sauer, the paralegal who was employed by Darnay Hoffman. And as I've said before, this is a theory I have. I could be completely wrong, but the theory is that while the housekeeper was sort of trying to cobble together a narrative with Darnay Hoffman's help and his sort of legal support, the paralegal either took over the narrative or was sort of doing it kind of in parallel. And as I've said before, both narratives never really saw the light of day. Now, what is really interesting in terms of where we are in the saga at the moment is, so it's this narrative and the other one that didn't manage really to see the light of day. The narratives weren't fully formed. They didn't really have a chance to, appear in print and be fully realized, right? But the narrative that I'm going to do after this in episode 30, I'm really looking forward to it actually, is a narrative that came out and by an excellent investigative journalist. And I actually found a interview with this particular person. I'm not going to tell you about it until tomorrow. I'll leave it as a surprise, but I can't remember if I've actually found this interview before, but it is an amazing, refreshing insight into the Ramsey case from someone who just has excellent credentials. So I'm looking forward to that. In this episode, we're going to be dealing with the Bonita Papers, and it kicks off really, really strongly with something that you don't actually often hear about because of the sort of narrative and counter-narrative. It's often you hear about the snow, no snow, the broken window, and that tends to dominate the story, and the Bonita Papers is a refreshing departure from that. So we're going to get to that in a moment. I first just want to quickly refer to other news in true crime. The judge in the Laurie Vallow case has dismissed the defense motion to remove the prosecutor, Mr. Wood, from the case. I actually called that on Patreon. I just did kind of an episode on that, and I just said that I thought it was very unlikely that that motion would succeed. I'm a little bit sorry I didn't talk about it on YouTube because it would have been a little bit of a feather in my cap. But anyway, overall, it's good that the case is sort of proceeding with Wood present. I'm sure he's going to be an excellent prosecutor on this case. But there were quite a few reasons why you could see that the defense case wasn't really going to get anywhere. There was a lot of waffle. The expert didn't really say anything much that was substantive, and if you went through the transcript as well, it just didn't look like there was anything really wrong with it. So that is definitely a positive step in terms of the upcoming trial in the Laurie Vallow case. Okay, and so without any further ado, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment. Also, a big thank you to the 200 or 300 people who've subscribed since the last video. And so let's get started with episode 30. I don't have a lot of time today, so I'm going to jump right in. So the Bonita Papers starts off with, and this is a quote, Melody Stanton awoke abruptly from a deep sleep. I think it's actually awakes abruptly from a deep sleep. So there's a little bit of a typo in the third word. So bear in mind that these papers are sort of a little bit raw, a little bit unedited, but nevertheless quite cogent, quite well written and put together. So it's about the neighbor, Melody Stanton, awaking abruptly from a deep sleep. The prior stillness of the bolder night has been pierced by the harrowing scream of a child. So I think that's quite important to stress, is that Melody Stanton woke up to a scream, and she could tell that this was the scream of a child. And I think she also said that it sounded like a girl, and it makes sense that it would be a girl. What immediately comes to mind when you hear this is, if the next door neighbor heard this scream, why wouldn't the Ramseys that were in the house? And something I checked out, you've got to go and look at the configuration of the house. You've got to look at where the windows are, in the basement, how they are oriented, because you're now looking at, you're experimenting with how sound travels. And so you're sort of looking at, would sound travel more effectively sort of through the basement window in a sort of a lateral, or let's say horizontal direction, and to what extent could the sound travel vertically? What are the distances involved? The other thing that I think you've got to bear in mind is, what is the actual material of the Ramsey home? And we know that one part of the house was largely made out of wood. So if someone was walking around, I'm talking about the floors and certain parts of the home, if someone's walking around, you could actually hear them walking around, which is also what makes the intruder story a little bit unrealistic. The same thing applies to the stairs. If you're going up and down the stairs, you know what wooden stairs are like. You can actually hear people on the stairs. So something else just regarding this simple fact is that Detective Steve Thomas went into the home, and they actually did a sound test, or a scream test, if you will, meaning they had someone in the basement, and then someone screamed out, and then they had someone on the top floor, I guess, of the Ramsey home, 755 15th Street, and Steve Thomas said he could clearly hear someone screaming. In other words, from the Ramsey bedroom, which is effectively, I think it's the third floor, he could hear the scream from I think the basement. So essentially through 4 floors, I guess. And the interesting thing is that another detective, I think, I'm not sure if it's a detective or a sergeant, but it's Trip DeMuth, he said he couldn't hear a scream. So things like that were definitely quite interesting in the Ramsey case, where you had some cops believing and taking up a certain position, and others seemingly stubbornly taking up a different one. So what I'm going to do now is just briefly dip into Detective Steve Thomas's book, JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. I must say this book is chock full of incredible detail. It's a great resource to sort of go into. So is Kolar's book, and so is Death of Innocence. Most of the Ramsey books about the Ramseys are well worth reading, just to get a different perspective. So on page 216, in a chapter called Rocky Road to Nowhere, Detective Steve Thomas writes, quote, "One night we tried to figure out if the parents could have heard JonBenet scream. While some of us stayed in the master suite," meaning, the upstairs bedroom belonging to the Ramseys, Detective Gossage tiptoed through the dark house, then shouted. Now, he doesn't say exactly where Gossage was, but I think you can kind of presume that it was in the basement. Now, I don't necessarily think JonBenet died in the basement, but I think to test this properly, you would need to, go into the basement, the furthest point, just to see if anything would be audible. Going back to Thomas's narrative, quote, "His shout was clearly audible to me, but Trip DeMuth said it was difficult to hear. We could even hear a shout from the basement, although our intruder theorists could not," end quote. So again, quite interesting. So it's like, it's like fake news. It's like you've got people from different sides of the sort of legal, the legal fence. So essentially you've got the people that believe the Ramseys were involved, that are in the house, and you've got the intruder people, and they simply can't hear something. So it's sort of like, do you think that they really can't hear, or is it a case that not hearing sort of supports their story? Now, look at what we are addressing here. If JonBenét screamed, and I think she did scream, and it makes sense that she did scream because it looks like, and what I'm saying now isn't a fact, it's not absolutely sort of incontrovertible. It's just something that looks this way. It looks like someone placed a wooden object, possibly a piece of a paintbrush or something like that, into JonBenét's genitals, right? And that must have hurt. That must have really hurt her. And that's not just a guess. It's not like random speculation that happened, because a tiny fragment of, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. I think it's pronounced Birefringent material. Now, Birefringent material is any kind of material with a optical property having a sort of refractive index that depends on, it's quite a mouthful, depends on the polarization and propagation direction of light. I think it basically just means it's sort of a glossy material. And how I understand it is birefringence is related to things like paint. And so it's not the paint that is on the bristles of the paintbrush, but the glossy kind of enamel painted onto the wood of the paintbrush. That is what broke off apparently in JonBenét's vagina. And so that does seem to suggest that someone poked her with this object, and this is what caused her to scream out. And it was a piercing scream, and you can kind of imagine that scream elicited a response from one or two people that were sort of engaged in whatever they were engaged in with her. And doesn't it seem like a clumsy response? Doesn't it seem like a strange thing for an adult to do in terms of, using the paintbrush, but also everything else? I just want to go into this whole thing of birefringent materials in a little bit more detail. So examples of birefringent materials are, for example, crystals. And I think it's also used in, birefringence is used in liquid crystal displays. So it's going to be something that is present in your phone, for example. What is quite frustrating in the Wikipedia page is it doesn't really address this whole idea of, that you can get this elastic, this kind of glossy coating, kind of like a plastic coating, which you could use on things like certain kinds of pencils and certain kind of paintbrushes. So that is why there's a little bit of uncertainty about what it actually means. Anyway, if we go a little bit further through Steve Thomas's narrative, he talks about we all agreed that Melody Stanton, the neighbor who claimed to have heard a scream, obviously that of a child, that is a quote from her, on Christmas night, could have done so. In other words, they were basically just saying that obviously Melody could have heard a child scream. So that's quite an interesting point, is that the people in the house, right, the investigators on different sides of the legal divide, were sort of not all in agreement. There wasn't consensus that the Ramseys would have heard the scream, but they all agreed that the neighbor would have heard it, right? Now, why is it important to kind of make the case that the Ramseys wouldn't have heard the scream? Well, because the Ramsey story is that they slept right through the night, and also that they weren't disturbed by any noises in the middle of the night. So in other words, at no point did they sort of wake up in the middle of the night, go and get something from the kitchen, or there was a disturbance downstairs, JonBenét was crying because she went to bed, or Burke was crying, or whatever. They just basically went to bed and everyone slept soundly, right? Which is a little bit of a stretch if you think about what confronted them the next morning. So the other thing that I think is, again, missing from this narrative is, again, it's sort of the rhetorical question I've been asking all along. Have we left anyone out here? So, if you are in the Ramsey home and John Bonet is screaming. Now, bear in mind what the narrative is from the Ramseys is that John Bonet was abducted from her bed. So where else would she have screamed? Now, whether you want to say it was from the scream emanated from her bedroom, or from, which is basically immediately below the Ramsey's bedroom and not far from Burke's bedroom, it's like literally down the hall, or that it happened in the kitchen, or that it happened in the basement. Bear in mind, Burke Ramsey is kind of sleeping in the middle of the house, basically on the second floor. So whether you say the Ramseys wouldn't have heard it, wouldn't Burke have heard a scream? Now bear in mind it's a piercing scream. It's a kind of scream that someone across the road can hear. And so you've got to now ask, how on earth did the people in that house not hear it if Melody Stanton heard it? The other thing to consider is perhaps they did hear it, and was that when the ransom note was written, subsequent to hearing the scream, being roused and all that kind of thing. Now bear in mind, Patsy's story, Patsy's version of events was that she said over and over and over, why didn't I wake up? Why didn't I wake up? And I've sort of covered that in previous episodes, that Patsy in different settings, I think one setting was before the photographer. I think this happened in February 1997 when her ex-photographer, family photographer, went to visit, Judith Phillips. She apparently sort of broke down in front of her and was saying, why didn't I wake up? Why didn't I wake up? But what if she did wake up? So what is interesting on page 216 of Steve Thomas's book, he talks about, I wanted to go over, this is a quote from there, I wanted to go over and talk to her, meaning Melody Stanton, right there and then, and dig deeper into her story. But Deputy DA DeMuth, okay, so now we know what it is. Deputy District Attorney Trip DeMuth refused, putting a blockade between police and Melody Stanton. And now you've got to think about what's going on there. Yeah, you've got a witness, and you've got someone that is associated with the prosecution, once again, saying to a detective, no, we don't want you to go and talk to the witness. And I like the scornful, sarcastic way that Steve Thomas kind of says, kind of in a few lines later, he says, with a wave of his hand, poof, DeMuth sealed off an important avenue of investigation, right? And so what should Steve Thomas go and do? Well, go and investigate Santa Claus, go and investigate the housekeeper, go and investigate this, go and investigate that, go and investigate every single dead end that we can think of. But an actual witness, oh, no, don't go and talk to her. Before we leave Steve Thomas's book, I want to just refer to something he mentions on page 217. It's just basically the page opposite the reference to Melody Stanton. And he's talking about what it feels like, what it sounds like inside the Ramsey home. And this is again a quote from midway through page 17. He says to Lou Smith, "We are here at 2 o'clock in the morning in a house that is so old, we can hear it creak every time we take a step. And nobody heard anything that night? No intruder snuck in and murdered that child?" And then Lou apparently answered, yes, they did. Then he says, no, they didn't. And that's how they argued. The point that I want to make with that reference is they are inside this house and it feels like this very wooden house. Now, part of the house is obviously kind of remodeled and so on, but the central part of the house, the main part of the house, was sort of this old 1920s house that was basically wood everywhere. And you know what those houses are like. Whenever someone walks from A to B, you hear them. And that also kind of gives you an idea that someone's either awake or that they're ambulant or whatever the case is, whatever the case may be. I really didn't mean to depart from the Bonita Papers for this long, but let's go back to it. So she provides quite a lot of detail here that Melody Stanton assumed that the scream happened between midnight and 2 a.m. And what that is already telling you is that the crime likely happened in the early hours of the 26th of December. In other words, very early on the day after Christmas. Now, on John Bonet's gravestone, the date of birth and death is given as, or the date of her death is given as the 25th of December, 1997. And do you think that that is accurate? Do you think that the date of her death is actually accurate? Because according to Melody Stanton, the scream and her death probably happened within a very short time of one another. And so it does seem more likely that it happened very early in the hours of the day after Christmas. But we've also got to admit that Melody didn't actually look at her alarm clock, so she couldn't be sure. Apparently the scream lasted 3 to 5 seconds, so it wasn't, how can I put it? It wasn't a very short scream. It was long enough to wake her out of her sleep, and then long enough that it continued, the scream continued. The other thing that I think is very important, and I kind of dealt with this under a lot of detail in the Oscar Pistorius case, because that was also about screams, and lots of people heard the screams in that story, and that's a fascinating narrative on its own. But in this case, Melody Stanton said the scream lasted 3 to 5 seconds and stopped as abruptly as it started. Now, what I imagine there, and I'm definitely speculating here, I mean, what you'd really want to do, and obviously you can't do it, but what you'd really want to do in a situation is play back the scream, hear the scream, and draw your own inferences. But the inference I draw from this description is that the scream, because the scream stopped abruptly, it didn't just wind down. It didn't sort of, there was a scream and another scream or whatever. It was one scream and it stopped abruptly. The impression I get is, in the middle of John Bonet screaming, she was probably smashed over the head. Why? To stop the scream. And it worked, right? I think the garrote probably was part of that as well, and I think that the garrote failed to stop her from screaming quickly, if I can put it that way. What I mean is, look, for all intents and purposes, if you were the neighbor, the garrote would have made the scream disappear. But in terms of the person present, if someone is unable to breathe, they can still make loud guttural noises, right? You can still make really, really loud noises if you've got if you've got a hand over your nose, a hand over your mouth, right? You can make really loud noises in your throat, kind of thing. Not for very long, but you can nevertheless still make loud noises that can be heard from a different room. You can try it right now. Close your nose with your hand, close your mouth with your hand or whatever, and shout with a closed mouth, and you'll see how loud that sound can actually be. Bear in mind, the garrote probably didn't instantly tighten as tightly as it did. It sort of, the impression I get is that it rode up her neck and then it eventually tightened. And it's difficult to say whether the blow to her head happened before the garrote or after, or if it was sort of in sync. In other words, if you imagine that there were two people on the scene, one pulling the garrote, the other one wielding the bat. So I do think it's important to think just about the scream being cut off and thinking what could have cut it off. And also, if you put yourself in the shoes of the perpetrator, someone is screaming and you are in trouble, you're doing something you're not supposed to do, and you panic, what are you going to do to address that? What are you going to do first to address that? So anyway, Melody across the road momentarily wondered what to do, and then she thought, well, surely the parents would hear and come to the rescue of John Bonet, and isn't that what happened? So I see we are about 25 minutes into this episode, so I think that is going to be it for the folks on YouTube. Thank you for listening, and make sure you're back here tomorrow for episode 30. It's going to be a cracker in the ongoing series on JonBenet Ramsey. Thank you for listening. So in previous episodes, I've spoken about being able to solve the Ramsey case within seconds.